Welcome to the Relational Recovery Podcast. I'm your host, Wes Thompson, joined by my co-host, Austin Hill. Today, we are talking about judgmentalism and the hard reality it is to be in relationship without being judgmental. I know this past year for me, I've worked really hard at trying to see conversations and confrontations and conflict in the lens of trying not to be judgmental and rigid and closed and trying to be more compassionate, curious, and open. And as we're all striving for relational health and well-being, I think it's a conversation worth having. So I hope it's helpful and I hope you enjoy. Thanks for listening.
Hey, Austin, it's good to be with you today, man.
Hey, Wes. Good to see you.
So again, this is the Relational Recovery Podcast where we talk about all kinds of things, but really related to how do we become healthier people in relationship with others. We are a part of a community of people in recovery, specifically around drugs and alcohol, but honestly around everything. And our view of recovery might be a bit broader than many, but we see all of us like in this process of becoming healthier, of dealing with unwanted behaviors. And so that's the context of all these conversations, and we hope that they're helpful. And today I want to talk about the reality of just judgmentalism, like just being judgmental and overcoming being judgmental. Because I think this is something as a leader I deal with. I think somebody who deals with unwanted behavior, I'll go ahead. I planned on starting with this primer, but I'll start with actually the end. I want to talk about I think in three categories but I think a lot of people in recovery are already judging themselves. Like most often individuals in recovery dealing with unwanted behaviors, they're already judging themselves. And so there's this reality of this self-judgment that we deal with. And a lot of times it can create this cycle where maybe, we're doing things that we don't really want to do, or maybe we once did, but now we feel stuck in them and we can't get out, which is what we might call addiction, or what many people call addiction. And we beat ourselves up for it. And then as we're beating ourselves up for it, we're running back to the behavior that we're beating ourselves up for. And it's this weird cycle that I think a lot of us can get into, and what addiction can look like on the outside. But, we judge ourselves, I think, in our context of being really faith-led people and Christians. There's also this sense of we can feel judged by God. And just that can get really tricky, I think, as we're trying to navigate life with God and life with others. And then obviously that's the last one, which is just judging others and feeling judged by others. And so really want to talk about those three categories today of just judging myself, judging God, judging others. And it can be a reciprocal thing. Sometimes, I might be judging myself, or sometimes I might be feeling judged by others, or sometimes I'm judging God or feeling judged by God. And so it's this interesting, again, it's all relational. Judgment happens in this kind of relational ecosystem. It's messy. But this is something, I think it's on my mind and heart because it's something that I deal with often. A category that I've really been trying to, I guess, hold myself accountable to, Austin, is I imagine there's two different ways I can kind of look at a lot of situations. I can be open, compassionate, and curious on one end, which is what I'm striving to be more of. And then on the other end, being closed, rigid, and judgmental. And those are the things that I struggle with, but I really want to move from being judgmental, closed, and rigid to being open, curious, and compassionate. And when you're in interpersonal, relational, trouble or conflict, and we've talked about conflict just here recently, what can happen is we start getting very defensive and very judgmental. And the definition I'm using when I think about judgmental is just having or displaying an excessively critical point of view. Right before we jumped on this call, you'd mentioned thinking through differentiating judgment and discernment. And I don't want to steal your thunder, and you can get to that later. But I think that's helpful because I want to define what we mean by judgment here, and that is that is just displaying an excessively critical point of view. And I think this is universal too. I think we all deal with this to some degree. And there's some scripture passages in the Bible I want to reflect on and some quotes. But before we get too far down the road in this conversation, I know I just set this up for you. When you think about this topic, does anything kind of come top of mind for you?
Initially, it's kind of, I think nobody has a good relationship with judgment, or we have a lot of like really intense memories or feelings that kind of bring us back to like some of the worst times of our life when we're embarrassed or shamed is when we felt judged, and especially judged improperly, but then or judged inaccurately or unfairly. And then another one is when we realize that we're being judged accurately, and that really where we feel really revealed and seen, but not always in a healthy way. And we really don't, like, I think a lot of us have that history with that. And so we really want to we kind of over exaggerate or go over the top to not be judgmental. And I think where we want to be very clear on is there's a difference between, and I think the opposite of for me, I heard you talking about the opposite of judgmental is being compassionate, or like curious compassion, which is true, which is different than saying I'm okay with everything that you're doing or saying. It's just I'm willing to hear it and showing you compassion and not reject you for how you think or feel. And that is very different than being I agree with everything that you think or feel. And we don't want to be judgmental in the fact where I reject you because of who you are. It's such a sticky spot to be in, or just like topic, because we use the word judgment, I think, in a way that often isn't accurate to what judgment is, especially in being a Team Jesus place. We all have our own experiences in churches, and church people are the best people and the worst people all at the same time. So I've had fantastic experiences with faith leaders in my life who have shown me compassion in ways when I didn't deserve it, and showing me, like, saying this is how God uses judgment through things. And it's not a scary thing. I think a lot of people are scared of God because, like, oh, he judges us. Because that's a Christian thing to say. It's like God is our judge, the ultimate judge on things. So he gets to say who's right and wrong. And that scares people. It scares me, not just people. But that's why I think it's very important to make sure, like you started off earlier saying, this is how we're defining judgment in this conversation. And knowing that from a faith perspective, and for guys who are in recovery, that judgment is just saying, like, this is a behavior that needs to change, and this isn't who you are forever and always, but it's a starting point towards, it's like judgment is needed in order for us to identify that we need to improve something or change something when we're talking about specifically around recovery.
Yeah, I think culturally we have such a messy relationship with judgment because, all of us, I think, talk out of both sides of our mouth. Like, I don't know. It's so interesting. Like, I follow pop culture to some degree, but there's this sentiment in our society that being open and being tolerant and being, just exploring the reality that we should accept all different kinds of people is good. But in the same breath, right, there's just this hypercriticism towards people that have a different perspective. And you see that in liberal media, you see that in conservative media, you see that in the church, you see that outside the church. And I think what's hard for us is we often struggle, I think, to see our own bias and our own blind spots, to where we forget the fact that we're seeing something from a perspective, and because we assume we're right, we think that we're the open-minded ones and the other people aren't. And it's just interesting how that dynamic runs rampant in our culture. Like, I was on Twitter earlier today, which I rarely do. And
step one wrong. That was the first bad choice of the day.
Right. And there was a pastor at the top of my feed that's got like almost half a million followers on Twitter. And this post was so, I felt like it cringy, like reading it, because it just felt so judgmental and so tone deaf, that it was hard to read. And then, me saying that, right, it sounds like I'm judging it, but it was just hard to read and then I started to read the comments, and man, it was a dumpster fire.
Gosh.
Of back and forth, and then I just turned it off. Because like you said, I made the first mistake of opening Twitter.
And the second mistake is diving into the comments section.
Is diving into the comments. Oh my gosh, it's just like the bane of humanity, right? But if I'm honest with myself, I see myself in that too. I go there, and in my relationships and in my context of leadership, and even thinking about the past week, it's so easy in conflict to become so judgmental and to assume that like I have the answers. And I guess today in our conversation, I'm hoping to give hope, that maybe there's another way forward that you and I can try to practice, and maybe anyone listening, we can try to practice together. So I don't know, what's your relationship with being judgmental?
I think it's being often too judgmental to myself, and not and I think, and when I say that, what I mean specifically is I know myself really, really well because of me, and if I do something wrong, I'm the first one to know it usually. And so I will snap into this like punishment consequence mindset right away, where it's just like, this needs to happen fast so I can move on and get to the next thing. But I'm also pretty harsh with myself. And that has connected to how I relate often to God, and thinking like he sees things right away. I mean, because if he's the God of the Bible, then he knows things right when they happen, or before they even happen. And so to me, it's like that harshness has seeped into my relationship with God, and kind of separating, like, because God isn't just a judge. Like, he doesn't just see the things. He's also a forgiving, loving God. And that's kind of where I've worked personally hard to get through this fact that like there's that consequence, and we should feel an amount of guilt and like sorrow and shame for something that we've done wrong, but we don't need to sit in it. And I think for me, judgment now, when I'm talking about in the appropriate way, for me, it's a starting point to something that can go in a better direction. So it has to happen. Because if we think about just like forgiveness or redemption or reconciliation, to start there, to get to those more beautiful things, we have to identify that something wrong happened. And sometimes I'm the reason that it happened, or someone else. Someone hurt me, I hurt them. But it's identifying, because you can't heal from anything if there hasn't been a judgment or a measurement that we're saying like we missed the mark some way. That's a judgment. Yeah. We either hit the bullseye or we didn't. That's not being mean. That's kind of like this attitude that I think we're trying to get to. If I'm reading the tea leaves right in what you're saying, it's not being afraid of judgment, especially like others judging us, but modeling this attitude, or I guess this desire to get through that moment of pain when it happens, because we are imperfect, and so when that happens, we are judging ourselves, or someone else is judging us. But that isn't bad. That doesn't make them a bad person. Or if we notice that somebody did something that wasn't appropriate or kind or generous or loving, that doesn't make us bad people for us identifying it. It's how we go about into the next step of addressing it, holding somebody accountable. And that's where that curiosity and compassion really does help to get through that difficult thing. Because what we don't want to do is say like, you're wrong, you're horrible, you're never going to get any better, and start speaking into their future in a way like this is who you are always and forever. Like
Yeah.
you're never going to be a good enough husband. You're never going to be a good enough son. You're never going to get this faith in Jesus thing right. Like that's not judgment. That's like condemnation and something a lot worse. And I think what I'm wanting to, I hope I'm trying to say the same thing multiple different ways so people can hear it. Judgment is not a thing to fear. It's the start of something much better, and it has to happen in order for us to move forward. But we don't need to sit in it.
Yeah. And I think as you're talking, like I'm imagining, I think there's different situations and contexts that we use the word judgment. Like we're talking about judgment in this sense of like being excessively critical. And we're saying, man, that's harmful to relationship. And we do that to ourselves, and we do that with God, and we do that with others. But I think oftentimes you've brought up like God and judgment. And I think cosmically, when we think about judgment, I just think of it in the most literal sense, right? A judge is someone who determines if someone's guilty or not guilty. When we think about like even our society, like a judge, is someone with a gavel that like, basically puts sentences on people based on what a jury or what an attorney and a defender, they're going back and forth. But we think of like, we think of the judicial system. And when we think about God in that context, if God, we believe God was real and he created everything. And if that's true, then God ultimately like made us with, a certain way, which means there is a right way and a way that isn't, the right way, just out of, because it's the way God made us. Right. And I think sometimes where we get really off center is we just assume that like God is always on the judgment seat with a gavel. That's the only image we have of God. And that surely is an aspect of God. If God is creator, then God made things right, and there's a way in which we can live that's not the way he intended. But to think that God is just always with a gavel ready to declare guilty on all of us, when I look at the Bible, that's not what I see. That's not what I see in Jesus. And I think that we have to remember that. And when we're being judgmental, we're the ones that are basically like declaring somebody guilty or not guilty. And that's where gossip can land so often. It's like, we're just, rather than talking to the person, I love, again, what Chet Scott says, like conflict is just a conversation to be had. And oftentimes the conversation we're having is with the people that aren't involved in the situation that's frustrating us. And it just gets so toxic. And and I do it and you do it and we all struggle to do it. And I think that there has to be another way that leads to relational flourishing. And all of this, I think, is what can really keep people struggling with addiction, because maybe they have messed up, and maybe we've messed up, and then the people that love us are judging us, and we're judging ourselves, and it becomes this kind of this rut that we can't quite get out of. And so I think we have to figure out what a more appropriate relationship with judgment looks like, and with God looks like.
Yeah, and I think there's freedom in understanding that if we are, because we're a faith community, we're saying that in order for us, what makes us a community is this guy, Jesus, that we believe in. And then like even more specifically, if you're in a recovery community, especially a Christian recovery community, there shouldn't be a fear in pointing out or holding somebody accountable, saying like this behavior isn't appropriate, not because I say it's inappropriate, but because we're saying that like us as a community and following Jesus say isn't appropriate. So it's not me measuring you against myself. It's me measuring all of us up against Jesus. And if we're trying to measure ourselves up against Jesus, we're never gonna make it, but it's something to strive towards. So we're kind of taking out this, like, I think a lot of the frustration and anger and hurt that comes from judgment is saying like, I know best. So Wes, you should be like me. That means you should have a mustache, but you don't. So you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
And then that's me. That's when we're saying Yeah, like that's what we're saying, that like that overly critical, it's like you're like picking the wrong things to be frustrated about. It's like
Right.
everybody needs to have hair that looks like this. Everyone should wear clothes just like this. Like that's judgment, that's overboard, that's exaggerated, and that creates division. And so having something outside of ourselves that we agree upon, like this is how we're measuring ourselves, that's when judgment can be used for healing and structure and safety. Not like we're going to use judgment as a weapon, but when it's a tool for healing. That's what it's for. Because if God is real, if he's fully just, that means he's making things right. He's not like putting pain on pain. He's making things right, redeeming all things back to himself, making them whole. And that's what judgment's for from a redemptive standpoint. We have to do that. And in order to have a redemptive standpoint, or like an appropriate understanding of what judgment's for, it's seeking mutual respect for each other, knowing that neither of us are going to be perfect. And because neither of us are going to be perfect, we should give each other permission to point out when we're missing the mark. And then not getting, like, I shouldn't get angry at you, Wes, if we have an agreed upon, standard where like, well, this is how we're going to treat each other. And if I don't, and I start treating you like a jerk, then you should be able to say like, hey, this is not how we are. This is not how we agree to treat each other. That's you judging my behavior, but we've agreed upon what the behavior should be. So that kind of brings up a whole bunch of other things where like if I feel judged by someone, but I didn't even know we were being measured. So it requires a lot of legwork ahead of time to like identify where these things are. And that's where hurt often happens from judgment, is because we're unaware of like what the expectations are. It's like we're playing a game and the rules change and we didn't even know we were playing a game in the first place. So it's a lot more than just saying you're right and I'm wrong.
And that's really good. That's really good. There's so many different angles we could take this in, but I think here I just want to read a couple passages from the Bible, because I think they're profound, and maybe they'll give us a little bit more context to talk through. But Jesus pointedly says in Matthew 7, verse 1, judge not, that you be not judged. Pretty straightforward. Judge not, that you be not judged. And I love D.A. Carson. He unpacks the verb there, and he says that this can mean to condemn or judge overly harshly. And so it really is talking about like just the harshness of criticism over someone else should not be something that we do. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10, this is the Apostle Paul, he says, I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind, in the same judgment. And again, theologian D.A. Carson, on that verse, he in his commentary, he talks about that Christians must work for the same cause, which is the gospel, the good news of God, by restoring unity and common theological judgment. And so in both of these passages, they're advocating for unity and against, really a caution against this kind of harsh criticism of judgment. So I just find that interesting that's a consistent theme in Scripture. I just pointed out 2 verses, but there's many that, yes, there can still be a standard, or there can still be right and wrong, a good and bad, all of that, without the need to be overly critical. Those 2 things can coexist.
Yeah. Intention.
Yeah. I don't have to be overly judgmental. And I guess you said it a minute ago, Austin, but I think maybe one way to look at this, a healthy way to approach this, is not that nothing matters and we can all just go about whatever behaviors that we want, because obviously that's going to harm ourselves and harm others. But maybe it's judgment. Things become judgmental and go off the rails and become unhelpful when, instead of being concerned about the other person's well-being, we're more concerned about being right, and we're more concerned about boistering our own agenda rather than the welfare and well-being of the other person. And I think when that's the case, that's probably an indicator that I'm not in the place of being helpful anymore. I'm not in the place that I think these scripture passages would be pointing me towards.
Yeah, and it also kind of highlights, is the point of you pointing. So like when I hear that, well, don't judge so you're not judged. That's like people can take that as like a tit for tat type of thing. Like, I don't want to do this because if I do this, then I'm going to be then I'll be judged, and I don't want anybody to judge me. So I'm not going to say anything. So what do we do if we see somebody who's doing something that's like unhealthy or unsafe or inappropriate? Like, how do we respond? Because the Bible just said, don't judge them. I was like, well, it's what is the purpose of us bringing something up? If I would say, if the point of me bringing something up to you is to separate you or to isolate you away from community, that's not, I don't want to nuance this too much, but just kind of really black and white. I think if the purpose of what Jesus is saying is like, we don't want to judge people because he's like, I want as many people at the table as possible so they can experience and hear what the good news is of being in this family, in this community. If the purpose so that's one side. It's just kind of like, so I have this tool of like pointing things out. Is it to isolate people or is it to bring people together? And that sounds weird, but the idea that like, well, it's like, why would I want to be around a bunch of people that don't think like me? It's like, because nobody thinks like you except you. It's this realization that like, we are not like the people who are similar to us. Like we're actually pretty complicated, different people. And if judgment is like, if you're going to use it, I love the analogy. If we can use a stack of wood or tools to build a wall or build a table, you can build something. It's like, so how are you going to be using it? And the whole point that I keep wanting to hone in on is judgment is not something to create division. Judgment is something is to bring people together to a higher understanding of each other. And that's a lot harder. That's like, to me, it's just like, that is one of those challenges of Jesus that is a lot harder to do. Than like, I don't know, like if you really think about it, it's like, so we're supposed to be pointing people towards Jesus by our behaviors, and we're not supposed to judge them, which means I can't say I'm better than you, because judgment's saying I'm better than you. It's saying like, I know more, I'm better than you. So we can say something about somebody's behavior and know that I am just as guilty of it, but I'm saying it because I want help with it too. That's how you point something out without being judgmental. It's saying like, hey, I know I saw you doing that, but like, I struggle with that too, man. And I know that if you continue doing it, it's going to hurt because I've hurt from that. But like, please don't do that. Please reconsider. That's different than being like, you're wrong. You're going to go to, it's not going to end well for you. Like that's a complete, like we're kind of saying the same thing, but it's just very, very different heart and why we're saying those things.
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody could sit down with me and say like, Wes, you're wrong. And I'm angry over you. You're wrong. And we need to make sure, I want to make sure you're wrong. Or they could sit down with me and say, when you said X, Y, and Z, it made me feel this way. And it caused some concern in me. I'm curious what it is. Can you tell me what's going on? Like one approach is very critical, and one approach leads with curiosity and compassion. And I think when you were talking, Austin, it just reminded me of like someone who's trying to understand the other person, not just tear them down. And I think when we're talking about judgmentalism, we're talking about you're really just so preoccupied with being right that you don't mind tearing the other person down. You don't mind being overly sarcastic and critical and snide and kind of short with that other person, rather than trying to understand where they're coming from, because we are not, we are not saying like the whole like, well, snitches get stitches. Like, don't uncover somebody. That's judgmental. That's not what we're saying. We're saying press in when you have a concern. Press in and ask questions. And if I really care about you, Austin, I'm not gonna let you do things or without saying something that might cause you harm or others harm. Like, it's just that. But when we're judgmental, it's like I'm not out to help you. I'm out to like. It's really more about me. And so I think we're supposed to address things that are concerning, but it's the manner in which we do that.
Yeah, and I know that, like, I've been, like, when I talk through these things, I know I've been accused of being, like, too soft on things, on people. I'm not saying be soft. I'm saying be, like, almost beyond persistent in showing people a better way. That takes a lot more energy than just trying to, like, exploding in anger and saying, like, you're wrong, and then yelling at them and hoping that they just, like, remember the shock and awe of you yelling at them because they did something wrong. I'm saying, like, we have got to be consistent in saying, like, this behavior is inappropriate. It crossed a boundary. It's unhealthy. It's going to hurt you and others. It's hurting me. Like, you can keep saying those things and not be judgmental, because the whole point is, if we're wanting to create a safe environment for guys to start to heal, there has to be standards. Because I think I think there's this fear that's like, well, if we don't point out something, like, if there's no judgment, then it's just going to be chaos. Like, no, that's not true. It's how we go about doing it. Because if we say there's no judgment here, and that's one of the things that we force on it, and I mean that. I don't think we should be judgy of other people. I think we should point out if a behavior, not the person, if a behavior is going to be unhealthy, and like how that looks if you're a guy like in recovery, or if you're love someone who is trapped in addiction. When you say, well, don't judge them, it's like, well, I'm not perfect, so I can't point out the fact that my son is using because I'm not perfect. That's not what we're saying. We're saying be persistent, constant in this desire and to get them to a healthier spot. Because they're like, well, you're not so perfect. Like, that's true, I'm not. But like, we're not talking about like my fast food habit right now. We're talking about your heroin habit. We're going to be very specific about it. Like, this is going to hurt you. Yeah, if I eat a cheeseburger every day, I'll probably die early of diabetes. So I should probably look at that. But right now, we're talking about you and your heroin problem. That's not being judgmental. That's being honest. It's being focused. And so it's, I think if somebody hears like, well, this is a judgment free zone. It's like saying, well, that means we're going to hold each other from a different standard consistently, because we don't want people to feel judged. We want people to feel like they have the opportunity to heal and be redeemed away from the behavior we're pointing out. And it's really hard to want to have some type of reconciliation or even a conversation with someone who they feel like you're just constantly berating them. But I would want to be around somebody who's constantly helping me think through the issues they see in me. That's like, it's the same thing. If I know that someone like Wes, if you are able to help me and coach me through a difficult situation, you pointed out that something wasn't right with me. Like, that's what we're talking about here. That's a healthy amount of, that's the healthy way to do judgment. If we're saying like, this is a healthy behavior, this is unhealthy behavior. There's ways to do this.
That's really good, man. This has been a helpful conversation. I think as we bring it to a close, I think all of us should ask ourselves, and listen, if you're listening, like, and I'm even reminding myself of this in this moment, like this conversation isn't for somebody else. This conversation is for me. It's for you. Like, we all struggle with this. And I think, listen, we need to engage in the conversations. Okay. This doesn't give us license. Not being judgmental doesn't mean that we don't engage in hard conversations. That we don't, if somebody I love is doing something that's causing them harm or causing others harm, or they keep saying, man, I want to stop this. It's hurting me. It's killing me. And I say nothing and I do nothing. Like, that's not helpful. So we got to engage in the conversation. The question I think we should be asking ourselves is as we're engaging in these conversations, are we more concerned about our own welfare, or are we more concerned about the welfare of the other person? As we're talking, as we're approaching this person, are we open? Are we curious? Are we compassionate? Or are we coming at that person with just rigidity and closed-mindedness and being judgmental? I think that's the question we need to be asking ourselves, because ultimately we want to be helpful. And I think that what God wants for all of us is he wants us to be in relationship with himself, with others, with the world around us, and want to have a healthy relationship with ourselves, and ultimately to feel loved, to feel safe, and to feel a sense of belonging. And so that's the hope. And so as we're engaging in these conversations, I think maybe that's the framework we need to look at, because ultimately we want to be helped by others and we want to help others. And I think that might be a starting point as a way forward.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Relational Recovery Podcast. We'll be back soon with a new conversation. We'll see you then.